Zadig, Chapter 3 The Envious Man. Zadig resolved to comfort himself by philosophy and friendship for the evils he had suffered from fortune. He had in the suburbs of Babylon a house elegantly furnished, in which he assembled all the arts and all the pleasures worthy the pursuit of a gentleman. In the morning his library was open to the learned. In the evening his table was surrounded by good company. But he soon found what very dangerous guests these men of letters are. A warm dispute arose on one of Zoroaster's laws, which forbids the eating of a griffin. "Why," said some of them, "prohibit the eating of a griffin? If there is no such an animal in nature, there must necessarily be such an animal," said the others, "since Zoroaster forbids us to eat it." Zadig would fain have reconciled them by saying, "If there are no griffins, we cannot possibly eat them, and thus either way we shall obey Zoroaster." A learned man who had composed 13 volumes on the properties of the griffin, and was besides the chief Thurgite, hastened away to accuse Zadig before one of the principal Magi, named Yabor, the greatest blockhead and therefore the greatest fanatic among the Chaldeans. This man would have impaled Zadig to do honors to the sun, and would then have recited the breviary of Zoroaster with greater satisfaction. The friend Kada, "A friend is better than 100 priests," went to Yabor, and said to him, "Long live the sun and the griffins. Beware of punishing Zadig, he is a saint, he has griffins in his inner court and does not eat them, and his accuser is an heretic, who dares to maintain that rabbits have cloven feet and are not unclean." "Well," said Yabor, shaking his bald pate, "we must impale Zadig for having thought contemptuously of griffins, and the other for having spoken disrespectfully of rabbits." Kada hushed up the affair by means of a maid of honor with whom he had a love affair, and who had great interest in the college of the Magi. Nobody was impaled. This levity occasioned a great murmuring among some of the doctors, who from thence predicted the fall of Babylon. "Upon what does happiness depend?" said Zadig. "I am persecuted by everything in the world, even on account of beings that have no existence." He cursed those men of learning, and resolved for the future to live with none but good company. He assembled at his house the most worthy men and the most beautiful ladies of Babylon. He gave them delicious suppers, often preceded by concerts of music, and always animated by polite conversation, from which he knew how to banish that affectation of wit which is the surest method of preventing it entirely, and of spoiling the pleasure of the most agreeable society. Neither the choice of his friends nor that of the dishes was made by vanity, for in everything he preferred the substance to the shadow, and by these means he procured that real respect to which he did not aspire. Opposite to his house lived one Aramazes, a man whose deformed countenance was but a faint picture of his still more deformed mind. His heart was a mixture of malice, pride, and envy. Having never been able to succeed in any of his undertakings, he revenged himself on all around him by loading them with the blackest calumnies. Rich as he was, he found it difficult to procure a set of flatterers. The rattling of the chariots that entered Zadig's court in the evening filled him with uneasiness, the sound of his praises enraged him still more. He sometimes went to Zadig's house, and sat down at table without being desired, where he spoiled all the pleasure of the company, as the harpies are said to infect the viands they touch. It happened that one day he took it in his head to give an entertainment to a lady, who, instead of accepting it, went to sup with Zadig. At another time, as he was talking with Zadig at court, a minister of state came up to them, and invited Zadig to supper without inviting Aramazes. The most implacable hatred has seldom a more solid foundation. This man, who in Babylon was called the Envious, resolved to ruin Zadig because he was called the Happy. The opportunity of doing mischief occurs 100 times in a day, and that of doing good but once a year, as saith the wise Zoroaster. The envious man went to see Zadig, who was walking in his garden with 2 friends and a lady, to whom he said many gallant things, without any other intention than that of saying them. The conversation turned upon a war which the king had just brought to a happy conclusion against the prince of Hyrcania, his vassal. Zadig, who had signalized his courage in this short war, bestowed great praises on the king, but greater still on the lady. He took out his pocketbook, and wrote 4 lines extempore, which he gave to this amiable person to read. His friends begged they might see them, but modesty, or rather a well-regulated self-love, would not allow him to grant their request. He knew that extempore verses are never approved of by any but by the person in whose honor they are written. He therefore tore in 2 the leaf on which he had wrote them, and threw both the pieces into a thicket of rose bushes, where the rest of the company sought for them in vain. A slight shower falling soon after obliged him to return to the house. The envious man, who stayed in the garden, continued the search till at last he found a piece of the leaf. It had been torn in such a manner that each half of a line formed a complete sense, and even a verse of a shorter measure. But what was still more surprising, these short verses were found to contain the most injurious reflections on the king. They ran thus: "To flagrant crimes his crown he owes, to peaceful times the worst of foes." The envious man was now happy for the first time of his life. He had it in his power to ruin a person of virtue and merit. Filled with this fiend-like joy, he found means to convey to the king the satire written by the hand of Zadig, who, together with the lady and his 2 friends, was thrown into prison. His trial was soon finished, without his being permitted to speak for himself. As he was going to receive his sentence, the envious man threw himself in his way and told him with a loud voice that his verses were good for nothing. Zadig did not value himself on being a good poet, but it filled him with inexpressible concern to find that he was condemned for high treason, and that the fair lady and his 2 friends were confined in prison for a crime of which they were not guilty. He was not allowed to speak because his writing spoke for him. Such was the law of Babylon. Accordingly he was conducted to the place of execution, through an immense crowd of spectators, who durst not venture to express their pity for him, but who carefully examined his countenance to see if he died with a good grace. His relations alone were inconsolable, for they could not succeed to his estate. 3/4 of his wealth were confiscated into the king's treasury, and the other 1/4 was given to the envious man. Just as he was preparing for death, the king's parrot flew from its cage and alighted on a rosebush in Zadig's garden. A peach had been driven thither by the wind from a neighboring tree, and had fallen on a piece of the written leaf of the pocketbook to which it stuck. The bird carried off the peach and the paper and laid them on the king's knee. The king took up the paper with great eagerness and read the words, which formed no sense, and seemed to be the endings of verses. He loved poetry, and there is always some mercy to be expected from a prince of that disposition. The adventure of the parrot set him a-thinking. The queen, who remembered what had been written on the piece of Zadig's pocketbook, caused it to be brought. They compared the 2 pieces together and found them to tally exactly. They then read the verses as Zadig had wrote them. "Tyrants are prone to flagrant crimes. To clemency his crown he owes. To concord and to peaceful times. Love only is the worst of foes." The king gave immediate orders that Zadig should be brought before him, and that his 2 friends and the lady should be set at liberty. Zadig fell prostrate on the ground before the king and queen, humbly begged their pardon for having made such bad verses, and spoke with so much propriety, wit, and good sense, that their majesties desired they might see him again. He did himself that honor, and insinuated himself still farther into their good graces. They gave him all the wealth of the envious man, but Zadig restored him back the whole of it. And this instance of generosity gave no other pleasure to the envious man than that of having preserved his estate. The king's esteem for Zadig increased every day. He admitted him into all his parties of pleasure, and consulted him in all affairs of state. From that time the queen began to regard him with an eye of tenderness that might one day prove dangerous to herself, to the king, her august comfort, to Zadig, and to the kingdom in general. Zadig now began to think that happiness was not so unattainable as he had formerly imagined.